What French civilians said when Britain fought on, while France surrendered 1,940. What French civilians thought when Britain kept fighting after France surrendered in 1940. ACT-1, the nation that broke in 6 weeks. June 22nd, 1940. Compiègne Forest, France. Inside a railway carriage sits a piece of furniture that has become a weapon of psychological warfare. Not a gun, not a tank, a chair. The same chair where German generals signed their surrender in 1918, ending World War I in humiliation for Germany. Adolf Hitler has had this railway car dragged from its museum, positioned in the exact spot where Germany admitted defeat 22 years earlier. Now French officials sit in those same seats, signing the armistice that ends the Battle of France. 6 weeks of fighting, 90,000 French soldiers dead, 60,000 French civilians killed in bombing and crossfire. 10 million people, nearly a quarter of France's population, fleeing south in the largest mass exodus in European history. Roads clogged for hundreds of miles with carts, cars, bicycles, and people on foot carrying whatever they could save. Dive bombers strafing the refugee columns. Children separated from parents. Elderly dying by the roadside. And now it's over. France, which held Germany to a stalemate for 4 years in World War I, has collapsed in 6 weeks. The speed of the defeat is itself traumatic. On May 10th, Germany invaded. By June 14th, Paris had fallen. By June 22nd, France is signing surrender terms. The psychological whiplash is devastating. France had the largest army in Western Europe, 5 million men mobilized. France had the Maginot Line, supposedly impregnable fortifications along the German border. France had the alliance with Britain together. They were supposed to be unstoppable, and yet Germany simply went around the Maginot Line, through Belgium, smashed through French defenses in the Ardennes, and raced to the Channel coast, cutting the Allied armies in two. The French military, for all its size, proved unable to respond to the speed and coordination of German blitzkrieg tactics. By late May, the British Expeditionary Force and some French units were trapped at Dunkirk. The evacuation Operation Dynamo rescued 338,000 troops, including 123,000 French soldiers. But it also meant Britain pulled its forces out of France, leaving the French to fight on alone. And the British left behind all their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, vehicles. From a French perspective, this looks like abandonment. The British saved their men, but left France to face the Wehrmacht without them. Now, on June 22nd, as French officials sign the armistice in that railway car, the nation splits in ways that will define the next 4 years. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the 84-year-old hero of World War I's Battle of Verdun, has formed a new government based in the spa town of Vichy. His message to the French people is simple. The fighting is over. Accept defeat with dignity. Work with the Germans to secure the best terms possible for France. Many French civilians hear this and feel overwhelming relief. The killing has stopped. The bombing has ended. Sons and husbands might come home from prisoner of war camps. A woman in Lyon, her name lost to history, but her letter preserved in archives, writes to her sister in America. Thank God it's over. I couldn't bear another day of waiting for news, of hearing the planes overhead, of wondering if Jean-Claude was alive. Pétain has saved us. But that same day, across the English Channel, Winston Churchill gives a speech to Parliament that will reverberate through every French household with a clandestine radio. Britain will fight on, alone if necessary. Never surrender. The reaction among French civilians to this news is not what you'd expect. Not unanimous admiration for British courage, not simple gratitude for an ally standing firm. The reaction is complex, contradictory, deeply divided, and reveals everything about what defeat does to a nation's soul. In Paris, now occupied by German troops who goose-step past the Arc de Triomphe in carefully staged propaganda footage, a 32-year-old philosophy teacher named Simone de Beauvoir sits in a cafe that yesterday served French intellectuals and today serves German officers. She writes in her diary, the diary that will survive the war and become a crucial historical document, something brutally honest. She feels relief that France has surrendered, relief that the killing has stopped, relief that she can walk the streets without hearing air raid sirens. But when she learns that Britain refuses to make peace, she writes, "The English are mad. They'll be invaded within weeks. And then, what was the point of any of this suffering?" She's not a collaborator, not yet. Perhaps not ever in the active sense. She's simply exhausted, and her exhaustion speaks for millions. Across occupied France, in the northern zone now under direct German military control, similar sentiments echo through homes and shops and factories. A baker in Rouen mutters to his regular customers, "The British ran away at Dunkirk and left us to die. Now they say they'll keep fighting from their island." Easy for them to say when it's not their cities being bombed anymore. This anger at Britain is real and widespread. Britain evacuated its army, saved its men, but from a French perspective, abandoned France in its hour of greatest need. Now Britain is safe across the Channel, while France suffers occupation, and Britain has the audacity to keep fighting, which means the war will continue, which means more French cities might be bombed. More French civilians might die. A school teacher in Lille tells her students, though she'll regret this later and the words will haunt her, "The British think they're heroes, but heroes don't run away. Heroes don't leave their friends to face the enemy alone." In cafes across Paris, French civilians who've made their peace with occupation repeat a bitter joke that makes the rounds. The British will fight to the last Frenchman. But walk into different neighborhoods, talk to different people, and you hear something completely opposite. In Brittany, in the coastal villages where fishermen have watched the sea for generations, an old man named Jean-Marie Caillot stands on the beach looking northwest toward England. He's 63, too old for military service. But both his sons were captured during the fighting. He doesn't know if they're alive. When he hears on a neighbor's hidden radio that Churchill has vowed Britain will never surrender, he feels something he thought he'd lost in the chaos of defeat: hope. He turns to his wife and says, "If the English keep fighting, then this isn't over. Then maybe the boys will come home someday." In the unoccupied southern zone, the area still nominally controlled by Pétain's Vichy government, reactions are even more varied, because there's slightly more freedom to speak, to think, to hope. A factory worker in Sand, Etienne says to his colleagues during lunch break, Pétain and his generals surrendered, but the English workers are still fighting. Maybe this war isn't finished after all. The class divisions are stark and revealing. The bourgeoisie, property owners, established families, those with something to lose, tend to support Pétain's armistice. They've seen the world turn upside down in 6 weeks. The armistice promises stability, order, a return to traditional values. Pétain's speeches about work, family, fatherland resonate with them. They want the chaos to end. Britain's determination to fight on threatens to prolong the uncertainty. But among workers, among the political left, among those who've always been suspicious of the establishment, Britain's refusal to surrender strikes a different chord. A young communist in Marseille, though the Nazi-Soviet pact technically means French communists should oppose both sides, whispers to trusted friends. The capitalists have made their peace with Hitler, but English workers are still fighting fascism. That means something. These fault lines, class, region, politics, personal experience, will define how French civilians react to Britain's lonely stand. And what makes this moment so psychologically complex is that nobody knows how it will end. In June 1940, German victory looks inevitable. Poland fell in weeks. Denmark and Norway fell. Belgium and the Netherlands fell. France fell. The Wehrmacht seems unstoppable. Britain, with its army evacuated minus all equipment, with its tiny population compared to Germany's, with its empire stretched across the globe, seems doomed. Every strategic calculation suggests Britain should negotiate peace while it still can. But Churchill refuses, and French civilians, living under occupation or under Pétain's collaborationist government, have to decide what Britain's refusal means. Is it courage or foolishness? Is it noble defiance or suicidal stupidity? Is it hope for liberation or guarantee of prolonged suffering? The answer depends on who you ask. Where they live, what class they belong to, what they've lost, what they still hope to gain, and whether they can imagine a future where Germany doesn't win. July 3rd, 1940, Mers-el-Kébir, Algeria. The French naval squadron sits at anchor in the North African port. Powerful battleships and cruisers that represent a significant portion of France's remaining military strength. The Armistice terms specify that French ships should be disarmed but remain under French control, with Germany promising not to seize them. Britain doesn't trust German promises. The Royal Navy appears offshore with an ultimatum. Join Britain and continue fighting. Sail to British ports for internment, sail to neutral ports, or scuttle your ships. French Admiral Marcel Bruno-Guenceau refuses all options. The British open fire. In 15 minutes, 1,297 French sailors die. The news explodes across France like a second invasion. In Paris, in Lyon, in Marseille, in villages across both the occupied north and Vichy-controlled south, French civilians react with shock that hardens into fury. Even those who'd sympathized with Britain's decision to fight on feel betrayed. A woman in Bordeaux whose cousin died in the attack writes in her diary, "I wanted to believe the English were still our friends, that someday they'd liberate us. Now I know they're murderers. They've killed our boys, just like the Germans killed our boys." Vichy propaganda seizes the moment with savage effectiveness. Posters appear overnight showing British warships firing on French sailors with the caption, "Never forget British treachery." Newspapers run front-page stories about the British massacre. Pétain himself denounces what he calls a hateful aggression. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir accomplishes what 6 weeks of German occupation couldn't. It turns significant portions of French public opinion against Britain. A shopkeeper in Toulouse, who'd been secretly listening to BBC broadcasts, stops. "I can't anymore," she tells her husband. "How can I listen to the people who murdered French sailors?" In the occupied zone, where speaking positively about Britain was already dangerous, Mers-el-Kébir makes it impossible. Even in private, even among trusted friends, French civilians struggle to defend what Britain has done. A young teacher in Reims, who will later join the resistance, writes in his memoirs, "Mers-el-Kébir made me hate the English for months. I understood intellectually why they did it. They couldn't risk those ships falling to Germany. But understanding didn't stop the hate. The attack creates a permission structure for collaboration. If Britain can attack France, if Britain can kill French sailors, then working with Germany doesn't seem quite so shameful anymore." A civil servant in Vichy itself, a man who'd had doubts about Pétain's policy, now tells colleagues, "The Marshal was right. The British only care about themselves. We have to look after France's interests, even if that means cooperation with Germany." But even in this moment of near universal French anger at Britain, something strange begins to happen. The hate doesn't stick for everyone. As summer turns to autumn, as the Battle of Britain rages in the skies over southern England, as German bombers cross the Channel every day in formations so large they darken the sky, French civilians start to notice something. Britain isn't falling. Vichy newspapers confidently predict British surrender within weeks. German newsreels show burning British cities: London, Coventry, Southampton. The invasion Operation Sea Lion is supposedly imminent. But weeks pass, then months, and Britain is still there, still fighting, still defiant. A baker in occupied Paris named Henri Dubois listens to the BBC on a hidden radio, volume turned so low he has to press his ear to the speaker. He hears reports of RAF victories, of German bombers shot down, of British pilots becoming heroes. He doesn't know if it's propaganda, if the British are exaggerating their success, but he notices that the Germans seem worried. The invasion that was supposed to happen in August doesn't come. September passes, October, November, and Britain is still there. Maybe, he tells his wife in whispers in their bedroom with the lights off. Maybe the English aren't finished after all. In the southern unoccupied zone, where Vichy controls the media but can't control every conversation, similar whispers spread. A farmer in the Dordogne watches German newsreels at the cinema. Attendance is mandatory for certain propaganda films. The newsreels show British cities burning, show German might, predict imminent victory. But they also show something else, perhaps unintentionally. They show British people refusing to panic. They show Churchill giving speeches. They show defiance. And the farmer, who'd thought Britain's decision to fight on was suicidal stupidity, starts to wonder. By winter 1940-41, something is shifting in French civilian consciousness. Not everywhere, not for everyone. The majority still support Pétain's armistice, still believe Germany will win, still think Britain's resistance is futile. But in certain hearts, in certain minds, Britain's survival is changing calculations. Lucien Aubrat, a 8-year-old teacher in Lyon who will become one of the most famous resistance leaders, writes later about this period. When Britain didn't fall, when they survived the bombing month after month, it changed something fundamental in us. It made resistance seem possible. If they could stand alone against Germany, maybe we didn't have to accept defeat either. The psychological impact of Britain's survival cannot be overstated. For 6 months, French civilians have been told by their government, by German propaganda, by the apparent logic of military power, that Germany is invincible. France fell in 6 weeks. Britain should fall even faster. It's just an island, isolated, blockaded, bombed daily. But it doesn't fall. And every week that Britain survives is a week that the narrative of inevitable German victory weakens. Among French workers, particularly those on the political left, Britain's survival fuels growing resistance. Communist workers in Paris, though the Nazi-Soviet pact technically means they should be neutral, start to see Britain's fight as proof that fascism can be opposed. Socialist workers in Marseille begin organizing discussion groups that carefully avoid direct political talk, but focus on what-if scenarios. What if Britain wins? What if Germany can be defeated? What if French surrender wasn't the end of France's war, but the regional divide deepens and becomes more dangerous? In the occupied north, German control is absolute and increasingly brutal. The Gestapo and French collaborationist police Frenchmen arresting Frenchmen crack down on any expression of support for Britain. Listening to the BBC becomes a criminal offence. Possessing a radio capable of receiving foreign broadcasts becomes grounds for arrest. A woman in Lille is reported by a neighbour for saying she hopes Britain wins. She's interrogated, beaten, and sent to prison for 6 months. Her crime? Hope. In the unoccupied south, there's more freedom, but it's constantly shrinking. Vichy police monitor conversations, investigate suspicions, create files on unreliable citizens. A teacher in Montpellier asks his students to write essays about France's future. One 4-year-old boy writes, "Marshal Pétain says we must accept our defeat with dignity. But the English show that defeat can be refused. I don't know who is right, but I know which one makes me feel less ashamed." The teacher keeps the essay hidden in his desk drawer. He doesn't turn it in to authorities. He's starting to think the boy might be right. Spring 1941. The war is expanding in ways no one predicted. Germany invades Yugoslavia and Greece. In April, both countries fall within weeks, reinforcing the narrative of German invincibility. But something else is happening that changes everything. On June 22nd, 1941, exactly 1 year after France signed its armistice, Germany invades the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German troops pour across the border, in the largest invasion in human history. For French civilians, this news arrives through multiple filters depending on where they live. In occupied Paris, German newsreels show triumphant advances, Soviet prisoners by the hundreds of thousands, Stalin's regime collapsing. The message is clear. Germany will conquer Russia in weeks, just as it conquered France. In Vichy, France, Pétain's government cautiously welcomes the invasion. Many in Vichy see Bolshevism as a greater threat than Nazism. The newspapers frame Germany's invasion as a crusade against communism. But in homes with hidden radios, in conversations conducted in whispers, French civilians are doing different math. A clerk in Toulouse tells his wife, "If Germany is fighting Russia now, that's men and equipment not aimed at Britain. Maybe that's why Britain survived Hitler was planning this all along." A factory worker in Saint-Nazaire, listening to the BBC French service through heavy static, hears a different analysis. Britain is no longer alone. The Soviet Union, whether willingly or not, is now fighting Germany. Two enemies of Nazi Germany where there was only one before. The strategic calculus is shifting. Then, on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Germany declares war on the United States. This news reaches France in stages, through controlled media and underground networks. For many French civilians, America's entry into the war is the moment when hope becomes plausible. A woman in Bordeaux, whose husband is in a German POW camp, hears about Pearl Harbor and writes in her diary, "America has factories, resources, an army that's never been touched by bombing. If America joins Britain and Russia against Germany, maybe, just maybe, we might be liberated someday." But skepticism remains deep. A shopkeeper in Lyon says to his neighbors, "America is on the other side of the world. By the time they mobilize, Germany will have won." This doesn't change anything. What does change things, gradually and unevenly, is the daily reality of occupation. By 1941 to 42, the German occupation of northern France has settled into a routine of oppression that grows steadily worse. Food rationing becomes severe. The official ration provides barely 1,200 calories per day, not enough to sustain an adult doing physical work. Black markets flourish, but only the wealthy can afford them. Working-class French families go hungry. The Germans requisition French factories, forcing them to produce war materiel for Germany. French workers are conscripted for forced labor, first voluntarily with promises of good pay, then through compulsory programs that send hundreds of thousands of French men to work in German factories. Jewish persecution escalates. The Vichy government, without German pressure, passes anti-Semitic laws. Jews are dismissed from government positions, banned from certain professions, required to register with authorities. By summer 1942, the roundups begin. French police, not German, arrest Jewish families in Paris. The Vel d'Hiv roundup in July 1942 sees 13,000 Jews, including 4,000 children, arrested and held in terrible conditions before being deported to Auschwitz. This is French police arresting French citizens, the Vichy government cooperating with German genocide. For many French civilians who'd supported Pétain, who'd believed collaboration was necessary for France's survival, this is a breaking point. A civil servant in Vichy itself, who'd defended the government's policies, watches the roundups and tells his wife, "This isn't collaboration. This is complicity in murder. I can't defend this." But others rationalize, compartmentalize, or simply look away. A businessman in Paris, whose company profits from German contracts, tells himself, "What happens to the Jews is terrible, but it's not my responsibility. I have to think about my family's survival." The moral complexity is suffocating. Is feeding your children by working for a German-controlled factory collaboration? Is staying silent when your Jewish neighbors are arrested survival or cowardice? Is hoping for British victory, patriotism, or treason, given that Vichy is now France's legal government? French civilians are making impossible choices with incomplete information and no certainty about what the future holds. And through it all, Britain keeps fighting. By 1942, Britain is no longer just defending. British bombers raid German cities. British forces fight in North Africa against Rommel. British commandos conduct raids on occupied Europe, and the BBC French service Radio Londres broadcasts every evening with news, encouragement, and coded messages to the growing resistance. Les Français parlent aux Français. The French speak to the French. Millions of French civilians risk arrest to listen. They huddle around radios with the volume barely audible, curtains drawn, doors locked. They hear Charles de Gaulle, the general who escaped to London and refused to accept France's surrender, calling for resistance. They hear news the Vichy press doesn't report. Allied victories, German setbacks, the war's true progress. They hear messages that feed hope. Jean has a long mustache, meaningless phrases that signal to resistance networks that supply drops are coming. A farmer in Normandy who listens every night tells his son, the BBC could be lying. The British could be exaggerating their victories, but Vichy is definitely lying, so I'll trust the British more. The resistance grows from scattered individuals into organized networks. Not massive, even at its peak. Active resistors are perhaps 2% of the French population, but significant. Railway workers sabotage trains carrying German supplies. Printers produce underground newspapers reporting the truth. Escape networks smuggle downed Allied pilots out of France. Intelligence networks gather information about German positions and radio it to London. And ordinary civilians provide support, hiding resistors, passing messages, looking the other way. A woman in Toulouse lets resistance members use her apartment for meetings. When asked later why she risked her life, she says, because Britain didn't give up. Someone had to show that we hadn't given up either. But the same street where this woman hides resistors has another woman who reports suspected resistance members to the police. She's not a fanatic collaborator. She's a widow with 2 children who believes Pétain's message that resistance only brings German reprisals that harm innocent French civilians. She thinks she's protecting her community by helping authorities stop troublemakers. This moral ambiguity defines occupied France. There are heroes and villains, but most people are neither, just trying to navigate an impossible situation. By late 1942, the strategic situation shifts dramatically. In November, American and British forces invade North Africa, Operation Torch. The landings occur in French-controlled Morocco and Algeria. Vichy forces initially resist, but after 3 days of fighting, negotiate an armistice with the Allies. In response, Germany invades the previously unoccupied southern zone of France. By November 11, 1942, all of France is under German occupation. The Vichy government continues to exist, but now it's clearly a puppet with no real authority. For French civilians in the south who'd lived under Vichy's government, this is a shock. German troops are now patrolling their streets. German regulations now control their lives. The illusion that Vichy represented French sovereignty evaporates. A teacher in Aix-en-Provence writes, "We told ourselves that Pétain was preserving France, keeping part of the country free. Now German soldiers are billeted in the house next door. What exactly did Pétain preserve?" The psychological impact cannot be overstated. For 2.5 years, residents of southern France could tell themselves they lived in free France, that they'd avoided occupation's worst indignities. Now they understand. There is no free France. There is only occupied France and the hope of liberation. And that hope increasingly points toward Britain and its new ally, America. By 1943, the tide is turning in ways even skeptical French civilians can see. The Germans lose at Stalingrad, their first major defeat. Impossible to hide even in controlled media. Allied bombing of Germany intensifies. The Afrika Korps surrenders in Tunisia. The Allies invade Sicily, then mainland Italy. Each victory, reported on the BBC and whispered through French communities, shifts the calculation. A man in Toulouse, who'd praised Pétain's wisdom in 1940, now tells people quietly, "I always thought Britain would hold out eventually." He's rewriting his own history, but the shift is real. By late 1943, as the Allies prepare for the invasion everyone knows must come, French opinion has evolved dramatically. Not universally die-hard Pétainists still exist. Active collaborators still work with Germans. Some French still believe in German victory. But the majority now hopes for Allied liberation. The majority now sees Britain's decision to fight on as having been correct. The majority now waits for the invasion that will free France. June 6th, 1944. D-Day. French civilians in Normandy wake to a sound they'll never forget. Thousands of aircraft overhead. Naval gunfire from the Channel. The ground shaking from bombardment. For those living near the beaches, the invasion is terrifying. Allied bombers pound German positions, but bombs don't always hit their targets. French civilians die in the crossfire. A woman in Sainte-Mère-Église watches American paratroopers land in her village, some caught in trees, some killed by German fire, some landing safely and immediately engaging in combat. German soldiers have occupied her village for 4 years. Now American soldiers are liberating it. But liberation comes with a price. The fighting destroys buildings, kills livestock, makes her home a battlefield. When she's interviewed after the war, she says something honest and brutal. I wanted to be liberated, but I didn't want my house destroyed. I didn't want to hide in my cellar while shells exploded outside. Liberation was necessary, but it wasn't glorious. It was terrifying. This is the reality French civilians have been waiting for and dreading. For 4 years, they've hoped for Allied invasion. But invasion means battle. Battle means destruction. In Caen, which the Allies expect to capture on D-Day, but which won't fall until mid-July, the fighting reduces the medieval city to rubble. Over 2,000 French civilians die in the bombardment. A man who survives writes, "The Germans occupied us. The Allies liberated us. Both destroyed our city. I'm grateful for liberation, but my home is gone." The moral complexity doesn't end with liberation. As Allied forces push across France in summer and autumn 1944, another reckoning begins. The epuration, the purge. French civilians who collaborated with Germans are arrested, tried, and often executed. Women who had relationships with German soldiers have their heads shaved in public humiliation. The process is chaotic, often driven by local grudges rather than actual collaboration. Some genuine collaborators escape. Some people who simply tried to survive are punished. A woman in Lyon, whose crime was working as a secretary for a German office, has her head shaved and is paraded through streets while crowds spit on her. She'll say later, "I needed money to feed my children. I typed letters. That was my crime." Another woman in Paris, who actively informed on resistance members, leading to their deaths, escapes to Spain and is never punished. The inconsistency is maddening but understandable. 4 years of occupation, 4 years of impossible moral choices, 4 years of suppressed rage now explode in ways that are partly justice and partly revenge. By autumn 1944, most of France is liberated. Paris falls to Allied forces on August 25th. Charles de Gaulle returns in triumph, walking down the Champs-Élysées, while crowds weep with joy. He will later craft a narrative of France, that the true France never surrendered, that Vichy was illegitimate, that France liberated itself with Allied help. This narrative is politically necessary but historically false. The truth is more complicated. Some French resisted, most French accommodated, some French collaborated enthusiastically, and everyone did what they thought necessary to survive. In December 1944, a journalist interviews French civilians about what they thought when Britain fought on while France surrendered in 1940. An elderly woman in Provence says, "I thought they were crazy. I thought they'd be destroyed within weeks. I thought we'd all be destroyed." She pauses, looking at the ruins of the building across the street, destroyed in liberation fighting. "But I also thought, somewhere deep down, that maybe crazy was what the moment required. Maybe sanity was surrender, and madness was hope, and maybe we needed the madness." She continues, "Though I didn't know that in 1940. In 1940, I just thought they were insane. It's easy now, knowing how it ended, to say they were right, but we didn't know how it would end. This is what makes the French civilian experience so profound. They lived through history without knowing the outcome. They made choices without certainty. They hoped without guarantee. Some chose resistance, and some died for it. Some chose collaboration, and some prospered. Some were punished. Some were never held accountable. Most chose survival, trying to keep their families alive through impossible circumstances. A school teacher in Clermont-Ferrand who neither resisted nor collaborated says in 1945, "People ask what I did during the occupation. I kept my students fed. I kept teaching when the curriculum was censored. I looked the other way when I should have. I spoke up when it was safe. I did what I could to survive. I'm not proud of it, but I'm alive." This honesty is rare in post-war France, where the narrative quickly becomes one of widespread resistance and minimal collaboration. De Gaulle's government needs national unity, needs to rebuild French pride. The complicated truth that most French accommodated occupation, that resistance was brave but small, that collaboration was real and widespread, becomes buried under the myth of resistance. But in private letters, in diaries, in conversations that aren't recorded for posterity, French civilians who lived through it remember the complexity. They remember being angry at Britain for abandoning them at Dunkirk. They remember feeling relief at the Armistice, even while feeling ashamed. They remember hating Britain after Mers-el-Kébir. They remember slowly, gradually shifting from despair to hope as Britain survived. They remember the terror of liberation fighting. They remember the chaos of the purge. They remember all of it, with all its contradictions. Paris, May 8th, 1945. VE Day, victory in Europe. German forces have surrendered unconditionally. The war that began in September 1939 is finally over. French civilians pour into the streets in celebration. Flags hang from windows, French tricolors alongside British Union Jacks and American Stars and Stripes. The alliance that seemed so fragile in June 1940 has prevailed, but the celebration carries undercurrents of complicated memory. An old man in Paris watches the crowds and tells his grandson, "In 1940, when France surrendered and Britain fought on, I thought the British were fools. I thought Germany would conquer them in weeks. I was wrong about everything." He pauses, watching French and British flags waving together. "But I wasn't wrong to be afraid. I wasn't wrong to want the killing to stop. I was just wrong about what was possible." This is perhaps the most profound legacy of 1940. The revelation that the seemingly impossible can become real if someone refuses to accept defeat. Britain, standing alone in summer 1940, looked doomed by every strategic calculation. Smaller population than Germany, smaller army, vulnerable to bombing and blockade. Logic suggested surrender or negotiated peace. Churchill chose neither, and British survival earned through the courage of RAF pilots in the Battle of Britain, through the endurance of civilians during the Blitz, through the industrial mobilization that kept weapons flowing, changed what French civilians believed was possible. Historian Julian Jackson, in his definitive work on France during World War II, writes, "Britain's decision to fight on in 1940 didn't just preserve an ally for France's eventual liberation. It preserved the idea that resistance was possible, that defeat could be refused, that national sovereignty was worth fighting for, even against overwhelming odds." For French civilians, this lesson came slowly and painfully. In June 1940, most saw Britain's decision as foolish or even selfish. By 1941, some began to see it as hopeful. By 1942, it had inspired resistance movements. By 1944, it had become vindication. By 1945, it had become legend. But the complexity of 1940 gets lost in the legend. The post-war narrative simplifies. Britain was brave, France was defeated but never broken. Resistance was widespread, collaboration was rare. The reality was messier. France was broken militarily, psychologically, politically. Resistance was brave but small. Collaboration was real and extensive. Most French civilians did neither. They simply tried to survive. And their reactions to Britain's lonely stand reflected this complexity. Some saw courage and felt inspired. Some saw foolishness and felt abandoned. Some saw both and felt confused. Some changed their minds over time. Some never did. A woman in Bordeaux, whose brother died at Mers-el-Kébir, never forgives Britain. Even in 1945, they murdered French sailors, she says. I don't care that we won. I don't care about strategy. They killed him. Her anger is valid, real, and will last until her death. A man in Toulouse who praised Pétain in 1940 and joined the resistance in 1943 struggles with his own history. I was wrong about Pétain, he admits in a 1946 interview. But I wasn't wrong to want the killing to stop. I just didn't understand that some things require continued fighting. A woman who hid British pilots, who listened to the BBC every night, who risked her life for the resistance, says something unexpected when asked if she was inspired by British courage. Inspired? No. I was inspired by my own conscience. But Britain's survival made resistance seem possible instead of suicidal. They showed that Germany could be beaten. That mattered. This distinction matters. Britain's decision to fight on didn't create French resistance. French people made that choice themselves. But Britain's survival made resistance seem achievable rather than merely symbolic. The psychological impact extended beyond the war. France's post-war identity crisis, how to reconcile collaboration with resistance, how to rebuild national pride after defeat was shaped partly by comparison to Britain. Britain stood alone and survived. France surrendered and suffered occupation. The contrast was humiliating and instructive. De Gaulle's entire post-war project involved rehabilitating French pride by emphasizing resistance and minimizing collaboration. The myth of resistance, that all true French people resisted, that Vichy was an aberration supported by few, became official history. This myth served political purposes, but obscured human reality. Most French people didn't actively resist. Most tried to survive under occupation. Most made compromises, small or large. And most felt the full range of human emotions, watching Britain fight while France fell. In 1950, a French historian interviews hundreds of civilians about their memories of June 1940. The responses reveal profound diversity. I admired the British. I hated them. I thought they were insane. I thought they were heroic. I envied their island. I resented their safety. I hoped they'd win. I assumed they'd lose. I didn't think about them much. I was trying to survive. All of these responses are true. All of them happened simultaneously in different French hearts and minds. The question, what did French civilians say when Britain fought on while France surrendered, has no single answer, because French civilians were not a monolith. They were 40 million individuals with different experiences, different politics, different fears, different hopes. Some got it right immediately. Some got it wrong and never changed. Most evolved over time as circumstances changed and new information arrived. The final word perhaps belongs to an anonymous woman quoted in archives from 1945. In June 1940, when France surrendered and Britain fought on, I felt relieved, ashamed, angry, hopeful, betrayed, and inspired often all at once. I thought the British were brave. I thought they were foolish. I thought they'd abandoned us. I thought they'd save us. I didn't know what to think because none of us knew how it would end. Now I know they were right to fight. But I also know that my confusion, my fear, my anger, all of that was real too. Both truths exist together. That's the legacy of summer 1940. Not a simple story of heroes and cowards, but a complicated story of humans facing impossible choices with incomplete information and uncertain futures. Britain's decision to fight on was courageous, strategically vindicated, and ultimately decisive. French civilians' reactions to that decision were complex, contradictory, evolving, and entirely human. Both truths matter. Both deserve remembering.